Good morning. My name's Robert Hattam. I'm the Professor of Educational Justice at the University of South Australia. I'm the convener of a Pedagogies for Justice research group, and I'm a senior member of a centre that focuses on research into educational and social inclusion. Just like to thank the organisers of this conference for inviting me to give this keynote, and my presentation is called Towards the Knowledge Producing School. I'm hoping this fits in with the conference title of Cultural Education, Bridging School and Community for Empowering Citizenship. Just to sort of get started, I usually begin with a couple of cartoons. I suppose for me, this is a very, very important idea at the moment. We can sort of go to Peanuts cartoons, and everyone understands that teachers are the actors that make the most amount of difference. And I suppose that's a sort of a key idea of mine, even though I'm taking some leave from how some of this is understood by others. In connection to your theme, another sort of cartoon from the same series. In this case, one young student just saying, "No one's going to give you the education you need to overthrow them." It does appear as though this conference, and certainly my work's attempting to sort of think more carefully about how citizenship education's works or doesn't work in schools, and how we might advance a much more active form of citizenship, which I think is sort of central to the theme of this conference and my own work. This is for Stephen Redelas, whom I know is a key organiser of the conference, who's a serious Borgian, and this is a cartoon for his benefit. I can send this to him if he'd like it. In Australia, it's very usual practice when starting off a presentation to be acknowledging the country that we live in. For those people who aren't familiar with the sort of history here, before British colonisation of Australia, there were about 240 or 250 Indigenous nations across the country. It's possible to buy, geographical map presentations of these, and in the last 10 or 20 years, it's now very, very common for people to acknowledge the nation, the Indigenous nation whose country we're on. And in Adelaide, we're on Gowner country, and so I acknowledge the Gowner people as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters upon which the city of Adelaide is being built, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and into the future. My paper has three moves. I'd want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the failure of policy logic in schooling in our country, and hope there's some resonance with what's going on in the Philippines. I then want to talk about a theme that I've been developing for the last 20 years, which broadly speaking is trying to advance a project where we connect the lives of our students to the learning that's going on in schools, and then to sort of think about how we might think differently about that project, but reframe it around what I'm calling the knowledge producing school. So let's have a look at the first move. But before we get to that, it's sort of important for me anyway to sort of be thinking about some things that are going on in our societies more generally. Schooling is part of the society. The schools have a key function for producing new people and producing the nations actually that we sort of live in. And so it's very important for educators to be aware of what are the trends that are going on in our societies. And here's things that sort of I take note of about Australia, and you have your own version of this. First of all, we live in a country where there's sort of intensifying of market deregulation. There's an explosion of economic inequality. It does appear now as though we live in societies where there's a sort of an economic machine that's funneling money up, and the sort of welfare state redistribution logics have collapsed in Australia over the last 20 years. There's a strong discourse of blaming the others, many words to be used here, but we could talk about particular versions of ethno-nationalism, white supremacy or neo-racism that's going mainstream in our country. We're now living in a sort of an intensifying of what some people are calling post-truth, and especially a systematic effort to deny the existence of climate change. But then there's many other themes here. And perhaps we can also see a sort of a de-democratising impulse and a shift towards more authoritarian government. In terms of the Australian context, it's clear to me that Australian teachers are now being fitted up with the truth of good practices defined by what's often referred to as the GERM, or the Global Education Reform Movement, to quote from Stephen Ball and Pasi Salzberg. That regime of truth that now operates as a global orthodoxy in education policy. I guess the sort of the spaces where the germ originates from would be places like the OECD, Europe, the UK, Australia, and the US, and this sort of reform movement gets exported to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, in Australia today, that reform agenda is increasingly under duress, and we could even push the argument a little and say that it's sort of failing miserably, actually. But before we do that, let's just have a look at the germ a little bit more detail anyway. And my version is that it's an assemblage or a combination of neoliberalising policy diktats and a version of educational science that's framed up under the metaphor or the trope of what works. If you go looking in the sociology literature, you'll find many critiques of narrow versions of educational learning sciences and the sort of what works paradigm. And here's my attempt to at least give a little bit of content to the germ. There's various axioms of neoliberalism. So there's a sort of a universal adoption of market-based social relations, massive deregulation of education markets, sort of a marketisation of schooling and education, a deregulation of governance. We're all being told on a daily basis that we're autonomous and responsible for everything. There's a foregrounding of consumer choice, accountability demands for public evidence of culture, of quality. The sort of neoliberalising project, again, depending in which country you live in, it's difficult to know exactly when it begins, but we could say somewhere around the 1970s and 80s. If you track it carefully, then you can see a sort of it does many things, and one of the things it does is it transforms values and cultures of the public sector and also forms new versions of subjectivities. And in social policy spaces, there's an attempt by neoliberalising to internalise our compliance with sort of policy logics. On the other side, we've got sort of an educational science that's in cahoots with neoliberalism that operates under the sort of what works metaphor. Sometimes some people call it school effectiveness or school improvement. Other people frame up the educational science I'm talking about as a sort of narrow version of what's so-called learning sciences. And if we had more time, we could elaborate on that, but that's not the focus for my presentation. If you're interested in my critiques of that, you could email me and I've got some more versions of that. In my country, the sort of neoliberalising school policy regime, basically, I think over the last 20 or 30 years sort of advances these four ideas. There's sort of a long-term devolution logic, which begins 40 or 50 years ago when we had a much more robust social democratic welfare state. But now sort of devolution's been recoded inside of neoliberalism. We've had a strong shift towards standardisation of national curriculum, standardisation of teachers' work and leaders' work. In which case there's sort of one version of the truth that's now being pushed onto schools and teachers. In the last 20 or 30 years, the federal government especially has been pursuing and foregrounding parental choice as a sort of key logic for school change. Fourthly, the countries like the UK, US and Australia have implemented what Pat Thompson calls cruel accounting, or some version of high stakes testing. And in our country, it goes by the acronym of the NAPLAN test, which all students have to be doing from about grade 3 until year 9 every couple of years. In terms of the sort of policy failure, let's just shift to some sort of quick accounting of that. just wanted to share with you a screenshot from a website from the Parliament of Australia, and just to sort of read out the text. There was a review in Australia a year or two ago by a banker called Gonski, and so the first part, there was the historic Gonski review report identified several highly concerning trends in the educational outcomes of Australian students. It found that over the past decade, the performance of Australian students had declined at all levels of achievement compared to international benchmarks. Furthermore, a concerning proportion of Australia's lowest performing students were found not to be meeting minimum standards of achievement. In addition to declining performance, a review found that Australia has a significant gap between its highest and lowest performing students, far greater than in many OECD countries. Disturbingly, the review identified an unacceptable link between low levels of achievement and educational disadvantage, particularly among students from low socioeconomic and Indigenous backgrounds. And maybe just to sort of summarise, Australian schools are going backwards in terms of achievement in comparison to other countries, and the equity gap is getting wider. And so this is all carefully reported on our federal government's website for the last few years, but there doesn't seem to be much going on in terms of really tangling with the sort of the heart of the matter, which is a failed policy regime that's still in play in our country today. We can add other dot points here. So we've got a persistent achievement gap. It's possible to make an argument that Australian schooling is often understood to be a low equity system, in which case the already wealthy families in Australia send their children to schools and they're doing okay, but there's a long tail of educational underachievement. Systemic inequality is evident but ignored in policy. There's a persistent appalling outcomes for Indigenous students in our country. The high stakes testing regime we've now had for 10 or 20 years is flatlined. Not much is happening there. We've got decreasing scores for the international PISA tests. There's quite a bit of residualising of public schools, and in Sydney and Melbourne, we've got what's often referred to as white flight. So white families moving their students away from multicultural schools and putting them in schools which have a sort of an intensified sort of white population. There's now a crisis for new graduates. There's very large numbers of teachers that leave the profession before finishing 5 years in classrooms. And there's now a crisis for aspiring leaders across the sector. The big educational institutions like state departments of education can't find enough people who put their hand up to be leaders. So by way of a summary thus far, there's now a radical failure of policy for Australian schooling that's driven by what I'm calling a science war, that subordinates, subjugates, disqualifies other knowledges that are urgently required if we're to reboot Australian schooling post-pandemic. The what works regime defines the what in terms of narrowly defined outcomes. It pushes teachers towards highly scripted forms of pedagogy, ritualised forms of practice that disavow the unique and singular character of every classroom, and asserts standardised versions of the good teacher that informs performance management and promotion, and hence insidiously forces compliance. Perhaps most significantly, the policy regime here is actually advancing the social stratifying function of schooling and undermining the professional autonomy of teachers, and hence dumbing down our schooling system from the inside. Again, we can map this back onto theories of society that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, that are arguing that neoliberalising government is trending towards de-democratising and pushing towards more authoritarian forms of governing. So it shouldn't be surprising that we find these trends evident in education and social policy spaces, especially given the significance of schooling as one of the key sites for identity and social formation of any nation. And to put this most succinctly, unfortunately in Australia today, schooling suffers from a knowledge problem. The major logics for policy have no evidence for improving learning, and there's also a radical disconnect between the official knowledge that's taught in schools and the challenges facing the communities that we all live in and the nation. I want to move from the first one to the second one. Oh, sorry, we've got two number ones, but I think we've done the policy thing, but I now do want to sort of confront the second problem, which is the sort of disconnect between what the curriculum offers and what's actually going on in young people's lives and their communities. So My analysis of the Australian curriculum suggests that young people living in communities that are being disenfranchised by neoliberal capitalism and the concomitant intensifying of economic inequality aren't provided with an account of how capitalism actually works against their interests, nor does it provide them with the capabilities for active citizenship, i.e. with the wherewithal to do anything about it. So capitalism's not on the agenda, and being an activist that could actually do something to improve your lives is only very, very weakly developed in our school system. I think that's the sort of key problem that's confronting our country, and I'd be arguing sort of goes to the heart of the title of your conference. But quite clearly for me, if we're going to be doing anything about all of that, we need to be squarely focused on it's a curriculum and a pedagogy problem. And a few quotes here from some Australian educators that I admire. From Garth Boomer, who was a South Australian visionary educator in the 80s and 90s. Unless we solve the pedagogy problem, all other efforts at reconstruction will be in vain. The curriculum is in the final analysis what teachers enact in classrooms, and a much pithier version from Bob Lingard, it's through pedagogies that education gets done. So let's all be talking about curriculum and pedagogy if we want to be building communities and developing active citizens. So in the space that I read and work, if you're interested in advancing pedagogies for more justice, if we can use that language, often the phrase critical pedagogy gets asserted in the literature. There's a huge archive here and there's many lineages, but conventionally or historically in the Australian context anyway, critical pedagogy studies often begins with readings of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a sort of key text by Paulo Freire, who was a South American adult educator who was educating peasants living in favelas in large South American cities. And here's the sort of a logic that I use when I'm thinking about critical pedagogy. First of all, teachers, leaders and schools are sites for policy enactment and hence sites of interpretation and resistance to the policy. It's possible for schools to be contesting purposes and responding to their own context more seriously. In so-called disadvantaged schools, there are many teachers who understand that doing the same is not an option, and there are multiple curriculum and pedagogical experiments that are operating with and against dominant policy logics. And such experiments provide sites of research for those interested in critical pedagogies, i.e. pedagogies for more justice. And most of my research is actually trying to either locate these pedagogical experiments that are going on in places, or else try and sponsor teachers to sort of be thinking differently about what they might be doing in classrooms in line with the sort of themes that I've started to develop. As an example, about 10 or 15 years ago, colleagues of mine in the University of South Australia won a very large Australian Research Council funded project called Redesigning Pedagogies in the North. And the North here is representing the northern suburbs of the metropolitan city of Adelaide, which is understood to be, depending on where you read, but one of the third most educationally disadvantaged regions in Australia. The title of that study morphed into Connecting Lives and Learning, which is the sort of second theme I'm trying to develop here. Our research, over 3 or 4 years, we sustained cross-school professional learning communities that worked with 30 or 40 teachers out of 10 very large secondary schools in the north. We supported teachers to research their students. We supported them to be involved in projects that aim for substantial improvements in the quality and quantity of student schoolwork. And we provided a range of resources, including time, our sort of critical friendship, curriculum materials and various research expertise. In the middle of that study, we had a go at trying to sort of think more carefully, pragmatically about how we understood pedagogy. And whenever we talked to teachers in the schools we were working in, we said, tell us about your pedagogy. they would say it's about relationships, but of course it's not a relationship between a mother and a father or an uncle and a cousin. It's actually an educative relationship. So how do we think about that? So in the first instance, of course, it's about relationships between students and teachers, but then that's not enough either. It's actually really adding another dimension. It's a relationship between students, teachers, and there's some transaction around knowledge. But also within that relationship, there's a transaction around identity formation. So in an educative relationship between students and teachers, student identities are changing. And I would argue that really good teachers, their identities are also transforming as a consequence of being with their students. And we could argue that for especially important for this conference, it's not just enough to know something new. The knowledge has got to generate some action on the world. So my sort of latest definition of pedagogy would assert that we're talking about the relationship between students, teachers, knowledge and identity, and how that enables some action. Now, if we take the sort of two main actors here, the students and the teachers, we can map how we understand the knowledge that both of them bring to the transaction. And if we go to the bottom part where you know, what do the teachers bring to the transaction? That, you know, mostly they bring their subject discipline knowledge, and we could talk about, you know, they bring vocabulary and attempt to try and deeply understand concepts. They bring wanting to teach skills, understandings. Every subject area has particular literate practices and probably even numeracy. And we could do more on that, but that gives you a clue about what the teacher brings. But what does the students bring is the sort of the linchpin for me. And mostly that part of my diagram is only sort of weakly developed in the profession. But over the last 10 or 20 years, I've tried to sort of collect up a whole range of options in the literature I read that talks more substantially about what life world knowledges do young people bring to class. And quite quickly, there's a funds of knowledge theory, there's place-based studies. Young people bring their own literate practice, which may be not the same as school. Young people bring their engagements with popular culture. They're all learning out of school, actually, and they bring the learning into school. And more recently, I'm trying to advance what I'm calling culturally responsive pedagogy, which is also another way of thinking about what young people bring to school. They bring their own cultural knowledges and experiences. Now, in the middle of this definition, I want to read some Lisa Delpit, who's an African-American scholar who in 1988 had this idea well and truly under control. And just to quote from her, I suggest that students must be taught the codes needed to participate fully in the mainstream of life. That's what the teachers bring, not by being forced to attend to hollow, inane, decontextualised sub-skills, but rather within the context of meaningful communicative endeavours, that they must be allowed the resource of the teacher's expert knowledge while being helped to acknowledge their own expertness as well. So what Delpit's arguing here, of course, is that, and maybe we can go back to pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire in that text always talked about teachers hyphen students and always talked about students as students hyphen teachers. So the teachers are students of the students and the students are teachers of the teachers, to sort of think a little bit more progressively about this relationship that I've got here. It's not a one-way exchange, I think. And I think what I'm arguing here is to ensure that, you know, it's a double way, it's a double-headed arrow, and we need to be thinking about how that works. So now, if we take the Delpit argument, she foregrounds tensions around what knowledge counts in the official curriculum. Too often, the only knowledge that counts is the knowledge that we're doing to the students, and the knowledge and experiences that they bring is completely laminated over. In which case, this question about which knowledge counts is been at the centre of decades and decades of debates in curriculum studies, and most recently has been taken up again by the so-called social realists. And just to engage quickly with that, Lou Zippen, a colleague from the Ripon study, recently summarises the social realist argument. They establish a neat binary orientation to the problem of school knowledge and argue for a definitive separation between school privileged disciplinary knowledge from life world knowledge, rather than a more dialectical interrelation invoked by Delpit. And let's quickly, because time will run out. The challenge then is to clarify conceptually and further develop this more dialectical interrelation between the student and the teacher and knowledge, invoked by Delpit and Zippen, in which case, how can we provide some clarity around the life world knowledges that young people bring to class? And a subsequent question, the pedagogical challenge then for all of us is finding ways to integrate life world and subject discipline knowledges in ways that don't trivialise either of them. That I think is the sort of, the foundational research problem for my research. So if we're getting past what I call highly scripted models of teaching, in which case the teacher's just doing stuff to the students, then there's a whole range of concepts that one can go looking for. There's negotiating the curriculum, there's connectedness in the productive pedagogies framework, the funds of knowledge approach, local literacies, place-based pedagogies, and you can follow up on all of these if you want to, but as I say, there's a very, very large archive of a sort of a menu really of many, many options that one can bring to the table. Just quickly to pick up on some of these that I really like. I really like the funds of knowledge approach, which has been developed by Gonzalez and Moll. And just a few quotes: people are competent and have knowledge, and their life experiences have given them that knowledge. With these issues in mind, Pat Thompson's coined the term the virtual school bag that invokes positive content for knowledges that all students bring into school. And, a question, if students aren't learning how to study their own lives at school, then what's the point? We can do place-based studies. From the standpoint of local knowledge, this approach analyses more abstract knowledge from familiar places. Place-based studies document regional cultures, maps community assets, researches local environmental phenomena, gets students to identify and investigate school community issues, creates internships and entrepreneurial opportunities for students to think through their relations through vocations. And again, why isn't the local school the repository for knowledge about the community, which is an issue that I'll raise at the end of the paper. Or there's the local literacies approach, which provides students with opportunities to make connections between their linguistics, cultural, world knowledge and experience and the topics, skills and competencies demanded by the official curriculum. And to quote McLaughlin, having an interest in local literacies, teachers recognise their students as master interpreters and canny theorists of the cultures that they inhabit. Young people are incredibly smart about their own spaces, but then they quite often never get an opportunity to share their own local theories about their lives and their places. And then there's young people's engagement with popular culture. That's a huge topic. Then there's culturally responsive pedagogies, and just to pick one from one of the most famous frameworks in the part of the world that we all live in is from New Zealand Maori educators, and their version of culturally responsive pedagogy has these elements: power is shared in the classroom, culture counts, learning is interactive and dialogic, connectedness is fundamental to relations, and there's a common vision of excellence for Maori in education. Again, I can only recommend that people, if you haven't started, to go and read what Maori educators are up to. More recently, I've been working on culturally responsive pedagogy, and I've got these 5 key ideas that sort of frames up my studies. So there's high intellectual challenge, strong connectedness to the student life worlds, cultural differences recognised as a positive asset for learning in classrooms. There's support for performing of learning in multimodal literacies, and there's a sort of an activist orientation to what's going on in class. and maybe just succinctly, I advocate for pedagogies that demand high intellectual challenge, are dialogic, are improvisational in the jazz sense, they're culturally safe and responsive, and develop critically literate active citizens. And maybe we can push on to that last theme for the last move of my paper. But just before we get there, if we're thinking about the sorts of things I've got on the agenda so far rather quickly, this seems to me to be the agenda that I'm trying to advance. We need to be thinking about the difficult work of sustaining dialogic relations in classrooms. So if it's not a one-way transition, then we're engaging in dialogue, but this is not straightforward. We need to find creative ways to learn about what's most existential for the students, and that's a very, very famous idea from Paulo Freire. We need to be able to negotiate with students the themes that they study, the learning processes and assessment practices. We're talking here about establishing the classroom as a research centre and teaching students to conduct their own inquiries, in which case the sorts of pedagogies that I'm arguing here are ones in which students are researchers of their own lives. So they're producing their own knowledge rather than just recodifying existing knowledge. There's a space for students to develop the capacity as canny theorists of their own cultures, and providing them with opportunities to take an active role in addressing specific social issues that they identify, and for them to critically reflect on the action that they could take. But what seems to be the case here is most of the archive that advances the ideas I've just described mostly frame up the problem of an individual classroom. There's huge archive of case studies of what individual teachers get up to advancing the sorts of pedagogies I've just described. But what seems to be missing for me, of course, is that teachers teach in schools. And so if we're talking about the sort of knowledge producing classroom, where's the knowledge producing school? And I suppose just to finish my presentation then, just to share some imaginary about how we could think about not just the classroom being a knowledge producing space, but how could the school do all of that? So some questions then, thinking about not only what knowledge, but other questions such as whose knowledge, pursuing a strong version of students as producers of knowledge, pursuing a strong version of setting students challenging tasks that are strongly connected to their lives, seriously engaging in devolution, in which case curriculum decision-making should be shifted to the school and the classroom, pursuing the logic of students as researchers to the whole school reform, pursuing schooling for active citizenship and curriculum for community development. I think, unfortunately, curriculum in our country, young people are learning so that they can jump through hoops and get to university, and there's a sort of complete disconnect between their learning and what's going on in their communities. Why can't we be rethinking how what students are learning are actually more intimately connected to the problems of their communities, in which case they can still get the credential, but there's something a little bit more, there's a stronger connection between the classroom and the communities that they live in. And finally envisaging the school as a repository of knowledge about the local community. And I guess as a way of trying to invoke my imaginary here, why isn't the local school understood to be a powerful repository of knowledge about the local community? Why haven't schools generated knowledge that could be accessible to the whole community about what's going on in those communities? Anyway, again, to bring this to a head, it seems strange to me, given the focus on whole school change in the educational literature, that whole school change advocates have yet to make a compelling case for the knowledge producing school and what that might mean for school-based curriculum and professional development. There's versions of the knowledge producing school. There's sort of teachers as researchers and students researchers together. Some people in Australia have and Chris Bingham, about 20 years ago, started to produce some text about knowledge producing schools. So here's quotes from Chris, and we'll have to sort of do this a bit more quickly, but here's chapters out of, the Educational Action Research Handbook by Susan Nofke. just a quote, "Thus the central platform of KPS, knowledge producing schools, is the commitment to changing relationships between students and knowledge work, between students and school, between schools and their community." And that does appear to me to be the sort of central theme of this conference. And that's the sort of grist for the mill that I think is sort of demanding sort of ongoing work for all of us. There's sort of alternative resources that I've been able to find. There's a book, Improving Schools Through Collaborative Inquiry, and there's Learning from Student Perspectives. There's many of those. There's Pat Thompson and Helen Gunter's work on consulting pupils to pupils as researchers. So again, we're sort of pushing that idea that the students are researchers of their own lives and communities. There's more recently students doing visual research. I think if we're going to be pushing this idea of the knowledge producing schools, then what sort of artifacts would students be producing about their own spaces? And clearly writing on paper with pens is only one very narrow way of doing things, but there's a whole range of other technologies that young people can be producing knowledge about their communities. There's John Smythes and his colleagues' work on what he calls the relational school, which I think's got some important ideas here. And just to read the last quote, "The school views its community as an asset with a reserve of skills, talents and gifts to enrich learning for students. Curriculum projects draw on local personnel and resources to connect students to their community and to gain an appreciation of local economy, environment and heritage." And that would just be a few things. "The school is viewed as a community resource and major contributor to community capacity building. Students are seen as teachers are seen as allies and advocates for students and communities in processes of community renewal and reinvigoration." And just a few last slides. Schools have always acted largely as consumers of knowledge, but there are some examples of schools as producers. It requires schools developing new types of relations with the world outside of school, and especially with their local communities, and focus mostly on community-based research projects. Again, the schools views its community as an asset. Learning tasks are designed that shift decision-making to the students. The work of students produces a product of some kind, usually an artifact or a performance, and schools can be understood to be significant neighbourhood assets with resources to promote civic engagement and strengthen social and cultural fabric of their local communities. I know my time's running out, so perhaps we just finish with the sort of middle of this slide. Schools become known as repositories of knowledge about their local communities, and that includes knowledge about the local environment, history, geography, economy, political economy, migration and decolonisation, and the list goes on. And on that note, I'd just like to thank the organisers again for inviting me to give this keynote, and wish you all well with the various discussions you're having at this conference. So thank you all very much, and that's all from me.